Hey y'all, back again here, ready to share some thoughts percolating in my brain after the first episode of our next arc of Campaign 4 of Critical Role, where we are diving into the Seeker's Adventure. But before I get started, wanted to update on the project I showed off. It's in progress last video. I figured I'd finally make good on my saying that I was going to crochet myself a pincushion plush. So I was able to find the buttons on Saturday, so got him finished right before I started watching the episode. Because I apparently, when I fall in love with a little animal creature in a show, have one response, and that's, I think I can maybe make this, which is a dangerous instinct to have, but I got a crochet fox out of it. But yeah, so let's get in and start discussing episode 12, The Giant's Belt, which actually opens, we have something we haven't seen in a while, but we did start with this whole cold open sequence where we actually start with a flashback. Specifically is called out 18 years to before Thiazi, like right as Thiazi is getting caught up in the what will become the Falconers' Rebellion. Though the first thing that caught me about the scene before Thiazi even shows up is that this is very clearly a moment with two people who are actually fathers, remembering the reality of those early mornings. I love the Brennan as a recent father himself, throwing out the, like, you're making a persuasion check, but you're using your wisdom because charisma's no help, and Liam meeting him there and raising it with, and I'll make it a disadvantage because I am tired. Just a bit of, had to smile at the moment of those two just going, even in this fantasy, there will be reality, and some things are immutable even with magic, and that is how hard it is to get a baby to sleep. Then Thiazi does show up, and we get in his frantic, exhausted rambling, some little bits of seed of world building of what was going on that prompted the Falconers' Rebellion. The first thing that caught my ear was he mentioned, I believe it was Mara Weaver the Cormorant, was arrested. Obviously, we had known that Cormorant, Einfasen, and Royce were the Sundered houses that had actually been on the side of the Shapers' War against the gods. So it makes sense that perhaps some of them, like it seems House Royce was at least decently thought well of among the Sundered houses, kind of before they, by the populace of one of the Sundered houses. Like, it doesn't seem there's this as much antagonistic mistrust of how they handle things, given their connection to Fairy and having sided against the gods, even though they did side against the Falconers' Rebellion in turn. But in the before the Falconers' Rebellion really made clear to people where the alliances of the Sundered houses lay, it's possible some of them had sort of more trusted positions, or I feel like I'm saying that wrong, because they clambered themselves into positions of power, but I think some of them were viewed more kindly in that than we get, like, people. You kind of assume people have always been afraid of Taconis, and after seeing Einfasen, probably afraid of Einfasen as well. But it seems, I'd just be interested to know what position this individual that apparently has a tie to the Cormorant house was in, that they're being arrested, A, was one of the tipping factors in Thiazi, at least, joining the Falconers' Rebellion, and B, the next thing out of his mouth is they disbanded the Druidic Council. Now, was Cormorant in some way connected with this Druidic Council? Was she a member of a Sundered house affiliated with the Druidic Council? It'd be interesting to see if we get any more of these flashbacks, just what that is, because I might be focusing on Cormorant because now, especially after this episode, they are the Sundered House. We have the least information about what their power base is, what their sorcery base is now we have 4 out of the 5 Sundered Houses confirmed as having some sort of sorceress origin, so I'm assuming we're going to go 5 for 5 with Cormorant, and I am still hanging my hat on Cormorant is the Dragon House. And I really want to know about that, and I want to know how dragons fit in to Ahriman, especially now that we know a little bit more in-world legend about giants, which, depending on your D&D setting, giants and dragons have some interesting interplay. So it would be interesting to know a little bit more about Cormorant and what their background is and how it fits into the wider world. We get a few more elements of what may have prompted different groups of people to join the Falconers' Rebellion, where there was a blanket ban on all warlock pacts in somewhere known as Telmora. The Underroad was mentioned. I believe it was they were having issues with demons on the Underroad, so it makes me wonder if this is part of the Dwarven community where he talked about, when he was talking about the Devalmar Pass being sort of a gift to the human empires because all the dwarf roads were underground. So I'm beginning to wonder, is Telmora in the Dwarven region? And forgive me if that is a proper noun we have heard before. I didn't remember noting it. But we do get that in the sort of group of conflicts that became known as the War of Axe and Vine. We were told this was a bit more of a scattered conflict, that Hal and Thiazi were supporting Telmora in the War of Axe and Vine, and now there is a blanket ban on warlocks due to issues with demons, that would even, run up against people that... And I love the tidbit of, like, a low-level warlock that doesn't particularly care about progressing any further, being just like, oh, I'll put out some offerings for fairies in exchange for spell slots. Makes me think of some settings where I think I'm trying to remember the specific term that they used to describe Eberron, where it's not a low magic setting, it's a wide magic setting where high level spells are still rare, but low level spells are extremely more common. Particularly the ones that adventurers tend to pass on that are a lot more useful in day-to-day life. Like just the imagining the sheer practicality of being able to cast Prestidigitation, Mage Hand, and Unseen Servant in just living. So the idea of people like, yeah, I'll put out some food for the fairies and get literally an extra magic hand to help around the house. Makes sense. And I love that that was an element of, there were people trying for that in the world. Maybe magic was becoming more accessible after the fall of society post-gods, where people were exploring other ways of getting magic, but and we see that again with the Sundered Houses kind of stepping into the Pentevral, where these old sorceress houses kind of saw magic as their basis of power and are trying to restrict wider access to it and using whatever grounds they can. In Dolmakyar, I believe they are capitalizing on the fact that magic is very unstable, so that if it's not regulated within the city, just disasters can happen even without nefarious intent, which means anybody who tries to skirt around the bans therefore must have nefarious intent, and that isn't hitting anywhere close to too hard lately in real world, but yes, it's just we're getting this interesting picture of issues that were starting to boil to the surface that we're seeing come up again, and I don't think it's a coincidence that this is a Hal flashback, not just because it's a Thiazi moment, but because we've got Hal involved with the Schemers table, where sort of Hal didn't go with his brother then, so he's having to fight the same enemy on a very different battlefield now. And I also wrote down a note. I apparently had somehow missed that Thiazi was Hal's younger brother, and I had somehow, just maybe as a younger sibling myself who has an older brother, I just sort of had Thiazi cast as the cool older brother in my mind that like Hal looked up to but didn't quite dare follow along that road. And it's a very interesting dynamic to me now knowing that Hal was the older brother that chose the settled life, watched his younger brother go off, and now wonders if he could have done something to protect him. Um, you know, that one may entirely be on me for either missing something that was said or just jumping to my own conclusion. But now I am invested in a character dynamic that involves half the people involved in this character dynamic are dead. But thanks to these flashbacks, we know we're not done seeing Thiazi yet. And that takes us through the cold open flashback. We move to the opening scene, sort of the establishing scene of the arriving in Riesengirdle, where we are informed this is where House Einfasen's sort of seat of power is based, and it used to mark the edge and the old border of the Oberdemian Empire, and was set up as a mirror to Dol Machiar, which sort of was the entrance point to the Orcish homeland. Which in my mind still makes sense that this is the house that is taking over the Revolutionary Guard. If they were the Sorcerer's House, that their seat of power was at the border. Even though we later learned that magically speaking, they've got the associated with storms and with giants, that practically speaking, they've got a very military focus. Again, it makes sense. The Taconis and Halavar were the priestly Sorcerer's houses. The Einfasen are very much presented as, characterized, and seem to be acting as still very tied to military, both defense and offense, and will make them a very interesting group to work with and work around. And I love that the dropping hints about the storm, because again, obviously, homebrew is on the table, especially with Chris and Jeremy at Darrington Press, and they've mentioned in the background that Critical Role will be drawing on their expertise for homebrew. But also, I love this kind of way of showing that kind of an example of flavor being free. I love sorcery as this sort of tying your character into these grander forces in the world. Like, you can't play a dragon. I mean, we'll set Dragonboard aside. Like, you can't play an actual dragon in D&D, but what does it mean to play somebody that has this draconic lineage? What is that connection of a draconic sorcerer? But there are several sources of magic in D&D that's always struck me as a bit odd, that they don't seem to have a one-to-one sorceress counterpart, especially when they do have, say, a warlock counterpart. It's the sort of thing like, why do we have a dragon sorcerer and not a dragon warlock? Why do we have an archfey warlock but not a fey sorcerer? Wild magic kinda hits that, but not really. And it wasn't until this episode that made me think, we don't really have a giant sorcerer. We have fighter and barbarian subclasses in 2014 rules that tie you into giants, but we don't really have any sort of magic classes. Now, giants do tend to be associated more with physical abilities, but they are also magical. Like, some of them are more prone to magic than others, but we also have runic magic. And so I love that Brennan's tie-in for that is it's storm sorcery, but it comes from giants. Possibly. Maybe. Almost for sure and definitely. Because storm giants are a thing. Giants come in various different power bases, but storm giants are some of the most powerful ones in existing D&D, mechanics-wise and lore-wise. So I had never thought of a storm sorcerer as a giant sorcerer before, but I love that idea. And I'm very interested to see what other subclasses may be co-opted for things such as House Royce's Fey Sorcery. I'm very fascinated to learn the mechanics of at least what Aranessa's got going on there, just as somebody who really likes thinking of how the different character classes can interact with the different entities that are out there in the D&D world. Yes, I'm one of those persons that has a document with about 15 to 20 different characters that I will probably never get to play. How could you tell? From there, moving into the tavern, or the beer garden, sort of, you pay for the drink and the food is free, especially once Julian overpays for the drink. Um, and it's a note. The first note I made in this scene is one that actually came up a couple of other times, where we are not backing off on the unnatural and uncomfortable physical reality of Octus's current undeath situation. Where we are exploring, like, okay, the stat sheet says you don't need to eat and drink, but what does it actually feel like if you try? And I ended up noting it later, in connection to the scene in the alley when he deals with the consequences of the fact that he ate food in this scene, which is a lot of times, and I'm guilty of this as a DM, but in the setting I was running with a vampire character, was characters like that were a lot more common. But this is one of the first times I've seen in D&D specifically. Again, we're almost, like, we are full past the point that I've seen in some of the Vampire Masquerade games I've watched actual plays of exploring the physical reality of this, but certainly in D&D, this is the first time at all that I have seen the consequences of being an undead sentient character truly explored. Of like, okay, let's look at some of those things on the stat sheet. You don't sleep, you don't eat, drink, or breathe. And instead of going, okay, those are pure mechanical buffs and situations and things you don't have to worry about. No. What is the reality of this? You were someone that used to need these things, and now you can't benefit from them. What does it feel like to have a body that can't process food anymore? That can't move it? Like, even the details of blood pooling in parts of his body, and like getting, instead of the grayish pallor tone all over, there are pink areas where the blood is just pooling because it's got nowhere to go and no way to move it. It really heightens, it's the, like, narrative reality of playing with this, of like, obviously not everyone that wants to play the species wants to go in on this and like explore it to this depth, but having seen some of the other games that I've seen Alex as a player in and running, I could definitely tell this was probably something he's worked out with Brennan, or at least had a conversation about, like, no, there's consequences for this. And you see that, like, as Brennan will bring him up, Alex will meet him there, and they'll explore it together. And I'm also very glad that, A, I am not the best at creating clear mental images of what's going on. I get the gist and the vibe, and my brain goes, that's close enough, impressionist painting, moving on. So, and B, thanks to that, I'm not as squeamish if it's just being described. I probably would have a very hard time if this was, shall we say, a realistically depicted live action anything, but as it is, I can listen and go, fascinating, and still be eating dinner while watching the episode. Based on expressions, I mean, they've stopped snacking at the table at CR for a while, but I definitely think nobody at the Seekers table is even tempted to snack during these episodes. I will admit, most of my notes on the scene in the tavern ended up being completely red herringed, because I, like a lot of the player characters present, wasn't really questioning the Lux so much as what the Lux was saying, like, oh, she's going to Venata, she doesn't know what she's in on, like, oh, is she gonna be used as bait, and then he drops that line about the things she spouted being nonsense. Like, oh, maybe she is a little bit in on more of the scheme, and then we get the disguise drop, and no, she's literally just one of the demon sisters. Oh. Which may mean the whole Venatus thing was just a ruse, but also I was trying to remember, we know it's in the Endless Night, but isn't Venatus one of the cities in the old Taconis land? If that line was thrown out to give a reasonable excuse to cover whatever Halavar was doing, looking for Wiccan tyranny, or what the Halavars were doing, looking for Wiccan tyranny, why they would pick a city that I'm not pretty sure, but I thought I was sure was in Taconis land. Normally you would name something your group is already doing, instead of lying about something you're not even doing at all. So, are the Halavars making a power play in the old Taconis lands? I mean, the whole Schemers Table strategy they talked about at one point was trying to set the Sundered Houses against each other, and it does make sense for the two most powerful ones that were already sort of counterpart houses to each other, and very clearly already do not trust each other. We had the whole thing with Wick's grandmother going, we don't know what the Taconises are up to, and we have to know. Pay no attention to your angelic grandfather in the basement. I am very interested to see if, like, we've already had the Soldiers' Table run into a Taconis scheme. Obviously, Octus is desperately trying to dodge the Taconis scheme, even as they're trying to unravel it. It just would be very fascinating if all the tables end up doing the Let's Play Halavar and Taconis against each other. Or don't even have to work that hard at it, because Taconis and Halavar are already trying to undercut each other, and everyone just gets a different angle about, like, which one they push, nudge, tip, or undermine. Moving out of the immediate tavern scene, again, we have my notes on the Octus, surgery in the alley, for want of a better term. And we've got Taisha following the carriage, and we find out that it's not just one of the demonic sisters, it's all of the others. Oh, yay! I'm sure this will have no consequences whatsoever. Like, on the other hand, it's great for the soldiers that are heading back to Dol Makyar. Like, let's get those three out of your way so you can unpetrify the lion. But also, they now think Octus is Wick and Valus is tyranny. I'm just very curious to know if this will actually end in some sort of confrontation, or they grab the one of the sisters that can see through disguises. She takes one look and goes, "You idiot, those aren't in disguise." And they slip away to go be a problem for the Soldiers' Table, and the Seekers are none the wise. They could either be something very bad, something very comedic, or something very subtle in the background. Though some of those sisters seem better at subtle than others. Cruelty, I think I can trust to handle things subtly. Enmity and Agony, I don't think so as much. We have the moment where the carriages are spotted on the Einfasen courtyard with the odd detail of the goods still being in place, though the horses and people are missing. And I like there was one little line that sort of helped justify something for me, like in the mechanics. Like I'm somebody that very often will come up with like a mechanic idea I'm interested by and then retroactively come up with a narrative justification, but usually will want there to be at least one. But I understand that there are some people that just, there's an ability combination they wanted to explore. Specifically in multi-classing, and so maybe the whole package has a reason to be what it is. Like I've played in a Spelljammer game with somebody who was a paladin rogue multi-class, but really what he was is he was an investigator. He was a vengeance paladin, so he had those abilities to track his enemy, and an inquisitive rogue, and bundled that together in the whole package rather than explaining his paladin oath and his rogue levels separately. So when we saw Julian as what we ended up just realizing in the first combat being a 2-level fighter, 1-level rogue, that could just be a dex-based fighter with some slight, dick moves for being a rogue. But we do get the line in this episode that Sir Julian was specifically trained in guerrilla warfare. Whether he was explicitly trained as in like an actual training regimen or just part of what he did in the Falconers Rebellion was guerrilla warfare, sort of just trained experience. That's, we literally just got the one line and my brain went, oh, that's the rogue level. And it makes sense. So it's one of those, again, we're not explaining like, oh, everyone who has a rogue got a dark and seedy past, but just like, no, you are a fighter, but you do have this, I guess I like that it was a specific thing of like, no, in general, you were trained to fight in the more traditional sense, but you also had to learn to move quietly and strike from the shadows. And like, there was this sort of side specialty training. So you're mostly fighter, but you do have that rogue level. And you can see, I want to say I remember watching a video where Matt has said he's willing to lean more one way or the other depending on how Julian develops and like what happens around him. And I believe he actually meant that more as like he'll let the character's personality develop around. But I want to say I remember there being something in the mechanics of like one of those, like he hasn't decided a build yet, but I could be misremembering that. So don't quote me on that, because the moment I started talking, the memory got fuzzier. But it would make sense of having of like, hey, if we have to lean more into subterfuge, when he levels up, maybe Julian takes a second rogue level, or if playing it straight and going straight forward works better, he's leaning into those fighter levels. Which brings us a little bit, speaking of subterfuge versus playing it straight, brings us a bit more into the Einfasen of it all. We have Valus tripping an alarm that was apparently meant to detect dark forces. And like they name drop demons, but we know she's not. So I wonder if it's meant to just sort of detect extraplanar, as we do know she is sort of drawing on dead divine magic, for want of a better term. It's just her undying loyalty to a dead goddess, or if there is something else going on with Valus. And then we get the characterization of Einfasen as the no orange house. And the note that I wrote it down was trying to make a play on adding insult to injury. If they skip the insult, they go straight to injury. Yeah, that'll be interesting. I remember seeing in the comments of some of the YouTube video people kind of asking why the group has not been rolling insight checks. And I generally think it's them as their characters playing off of the insight check that got them this information about Einfasen. Of like, this is a house that plays it straight. And if you watch the cooldown, they're still not entirely sure Einfasen's not going to sell them out for reasons of maybe the Taconis is the stronger house right now. But they don't seem to think that it was a lie from the start, because Einfasen is not a house known to do that. Now, whether specific members of the house may be better at subterfuge and the party is sort of putting themselves in a more risky position, remains to be seen, but also I think is perfectly in character for them. Again, there were elements they talked about in the cooldown about why some of them may be a bit more overconfident in some areas than perhaps they should be, but that as players, they're interested in playing into that. Also, side note on Taisha using Mending on Octus, the moment we had the, lay on hands, honestly, the moment that Octus started leaking because he still has the slash wound in his chest and the stitches, I will admit, my brain, as somebody that generally picks up Mending on every character that can have it just because Again, I work with needles, thread, yarn, crochet hooks. I love the idea of a spell kind of working with that and just putting things together and fixing things. My brain was shouting mending, mending, mending from the moment that came up. So I was very glad that somebody had the spell and somebody tried it, and apparently it works. And yeah, it does kind of make sense that an undead character is actually a little closer to a construct in some ways than a living character. Um, so that was a bit fun to have the inner voice in the back of my head get an answer. It was very nice, and I appreciated it. Um, and then the whole going back and forth about, is Einfasen in on it? Were they deceived? I had a lot of worried notes going one way or the other. Um, my last note being, well, we better hope they're not in on it, because now we've dropped that bomb. And you always love it when a DM doesn't have to call for a roll because a player character noticed anyway. And I don't know that Brennan would have called for any kind of roll to notice that Greta had not come back yet and had made it, like, had been dismissed and not returned. Because Brennan is the sort of DM that in a high stakes environment, like, he might not have called attention to the fact. And the fact that one of the players clocked it and called it out was very neat. And, you know, Brennan is someone that has gone on the record to say for, like, he doesn't call for rolls when a player role plays a nat 20. Though specifically in Calamity, where Marisha basically called that a particular character could not be resurrected because they weren't dead. And then we get clarification on the relationship between Otto Einfasen, who is the head of House Einfasen, and the Einfasen who is making his moves with the Revolutionary Guard. So that specifically is the nephew of Otto, therefore the cousin of Ingrid. No real confirmation one way or the other about whether the nephew is acting with the full knowledge of his house behind him, if the nephew is in league with Taconis, or if the nephew is acting on his own, or if there's just sort of a group, and it's unclear at this point whether all the power plays the Sundered Houses are making are through some sort of agreement where they're all making their power plays to sort of grab power for the unit, or if these are individual houses kicking off the power plays to try to counterbalance each other. Or if there's even people trying to make power plays within their own houses. Is this the nephew trying to take power from his uncle and become the head of the house by gaining the backing of forces within Dol Makyar? And then we have that moment where everybody walks into the courtyard. We've got the guards on the wall. We've got Octus with about 4 hours left of disguise self for answering some very interesting questions for the house that pretty much it seems like the only question they ask is, did you just lie to me? And depending on the answer to that, you get a hammer to the head. So even if this isn't an ambush they walked into, they are not safe. And that is a very fascinating place to leave this episode. I genuinely cannot tell if the next episode will be figuring out an either way to get Einfasen to agree to let them go quickly, and or sneaking out of this house as quickly as possible, or whether the next session is entirely within House Einfasen and trying to navigate how to get Octus out of here without having him die again. But either way, I am fascinated and eager to see this, and looking forward to the next episode. Trying to think of question to throw in. I guess because my mind is so caught on how Brennan and Alex are working together to sort of explore what it is to be this Hollow One in, I believe, the specific case of Alex's character. But have you either played or theorized about a character with, some connection to the undead. I know the Reborn and the Dampier are both player character options. Have you been in a party with one, or have you DM'd for one? And if you did, what was your approach to handling it? And, um, you know, was it a campaign that could have borne a bit more of this, like we have here in Armon with leaning into it, or did the flavor of it lean into a bit more of letting it pass? Like I actually have a Reborn character that I DM for. Player recently retired him, but was almost literally a bit more of a reincarnation sort of character, and so while he didn't need to eat and drink, he enjoyed the finer things of life. So it was a bit more legacy questions than physical reality questions, and different campaigns it bears out differently. But just curious if you've ever played with, or ran for characters that sort of deal with undeath, and how you've seen it handled, and if you would ever be curious about running a character or running for a character kind of more in this vein. And with that, I will see you all next week for our next Seeker's Table episode. Unless... I'm going to have to check the schedule. It occurs to me that this is the final Thursday of the month, but we did get the extended break earlier in January. I will be back after the next episode, whenever it airs. And I probably should have checked the schedule to see if that's this Thursday or the one after. In any case, I will see you all then, and thank you for listening to me ramble. Bye, y'all.